The kitchen had been quiet for 3 hours before Miss Cecily Farrow heard the name spoken in a voice she would not forget. She was not meant to be there. The servants' passage ran behind the dining room wall, a narrow corridor of stone and shadow used by footmen carrying covered dishes from the scullery to the table. And Cecily had ducked into it only to avoid Lady Ashmore, who had been following her through the house for the better part of the evening, with a look of patient, polished satisfaction on her face. The dinner was in full progress. 30 candles burned in the chandelier above the long table. The Duke of Wyndham was at its head, and somewhere beyond that wall, Lord Carteret was saying to the gentleman beside him that it was a great pity the household's new cook had turned out to be so dangerously incompetent. Cecily pressed herself against the cold stone. She was the household's new cook. She had held the position for 11 days. She had not poisoned anyone. What she had done, as she would later understand, was see something she was not supposed to see. That was the whole of it, the exact extent of her transgression in Lord Carteret's account of the world, and it sat in her chest like a stone as she stood in the dark corridor and listened to her name being unmade. The night had begun simply enough. Cecily had arrived at Ashmore Park in late November, the post-chaise from Bath rattling through the iron gates in a thin rain, her one good trunk strapped to the roof, and a letter of reference folded in her hand that had cost her the last of her pride to write. She was 24 years old. She was the daughter of a gentleman who had died owing debts she had not known existed, and the season had examined her circumstances with the particular efficiency of an institution that does not require encouragement to render a verdict. She was a woman who needed employment. The cook's position had been offered through a solicitor named Mr. Hadley, who had met her in his Bath office and explained only that the Duke's household was in a period of transition and that capable, discreet staff were required. She had been capable. She had been discreet. She had taken on the management of a kitchen of 8, produced 3 successful dinners for company, and kept herself at a careful remove from every piece of business that was not her own. Then she had seen the letter. It had been on the 3rd morning. She had risen before 5 o'clock to check the proving bread and found on the kitchen table a folded sheet of paper with a broken seal. It was face down. She had not touched it. The corner had been tucked under the flour jar in a way that lifted it slightly, and the words visible in the gap were enough to lodge themselves behind her eyes and stay there. She saw the word Powders. She saw the word Thursday. She saw the name Hartfield written in a hand she did not recognize. Lord Hartfield was the Duke of Wyndham's elder brother. She had not touched the letter. She had placed the flour jar flat and gone on with the bread. She had said nothing to anyone. She had done her work that day as she had done it every day, thoroughly and without drawing attention, and she had gone to bed that night with the 3 words arranged behind her closed eyes in a row she could not quite interpret. She remembered them now, pressed against the cold stone of the servants' passage, while Lord Carteret, somewhere beyond the wall, remarked to his companion that the girl from Bath had arrived without proper recommendations, that certain symptoms had been observed in the household since her arrival, and that it was only a matter of time before the Duke came to understand what was plainly visible to everyone else. If you have ever listened to a lie take root in a room full of people, you understand the particular quality of the silence that followed. The gentleman beside Lord Carteret said nothing to contradict the account. Cecily heard the clink of crystal and the faint scrape of a chair and the sound of a table of 30 people not objecting. Then she heard a different voice. Low. Measured. The words short and stripped of ceremony, every syllable carrying the kind of authority that does not raise itself to be heard. You will name your source, Carteret, or you will not name the accusation again at my table. A silence followed, more deliberate than the first. "Your Grace," Lord Carteret began. "The name," said the Duke of Wyndham, "of your source." The kitchen bell rang at that moment, pulling Cecily back into the scullery before she could hear what Lord Carteret said next. She stood at the work table, with her hands flat against the surface, and the cool stone pressing through her palms. And she understood, with a clarity that had nothing comfortable in it, that something was happening in this household that had begun long before she arrived, and that she was being arranged as its explanation. The Duke of Wyndham had not spoken to her directly in the 11 days she had been at Ashmore Park. He was a man of 35, tall and spare-framed, with dark hair that he wore without the fashionable disorder of younger gentlemen, and a face that had been handsome once and was now simply authoritative. The household ran on his attention the way a clock runs on a wound spring, and his attention was precise and unflinching. He noticed when the dining-room candles were trimmed unevenly. He noticed when a footman had shortened a hem on his livery without asking. He noticed, she had been told by Mrs. Prewitt, the housekeeper, everything that entered or left this house, every arrangement, every departure, every letter on the hall table. If he had noticed Cecily Farrow in the kitchen below, she had not been told of it. She found out differently. The morning after the dinner, she came upstairs from the kitchen to find Mr. Hadley waiting in the servants' hall with his coat still damp from the November cold. He had a look on his face that she recognized from a year ago, from the morning she had sat across from a different solicitor and learned what her father's estate actually contained. It was the look of a man about to say something irreversible and trying to say it as cleanly as possible. "Miss Farrow," he said, "His Grace requests a word." The Duke of Wyndham's study was a room at the corner of the house where 2 walls of windows overlooked the park and the gray sky beyond the stone wall. He was standing when she entered, and he did not sit. Mrs. Prewitt had told her once, in a matter-of-fact way, that when the Duke sat for an interview, it meant the business was routine. When he stood, it was not. "Miss Farrow." He spoke her name as though recording it, without inflection, without performance. "I am going to ask you a question, and I would ask that you answer it without what I suspect will be your first instinct, which is to consider what answer serves you best." Cecily clasped her hands in front of her. "Yes, Your Grace." "Have you at any time prepared or introduced any substance into this household's food or drink that was not a recognized culinary ingredient?" "No, Your Grace." "Have you at any time handled, stored, or disposed of any package, parcel, or correspondence that arrived in this household addressed to anyone other than yourself?" She was quiet for a moment. It was a brief quiet, 3 seconds at most, and she watched him register it. His head did not turn. Nothing on his face shifted. The stillness of a man who has learned to read rooms from a position of absolute composure, who has spent 35 years perfecting the discipline of remaining present without performing it. She felt the quality of his attention change the way the light changes when a cloud moves over the sun. "I found a letter on the kitchen table on the 3rd morning of my employment," she said. "It was face down. I did not read it. I moved a jar that had been placed on top of it and replaced the jar flat, and I did not touch the letter again. I told no one. I know it was on the table because I came downstairs before 5 o'clock, and it was not there when I had gone to bed the previous night." He looked at her steadily. "What did you see?" She told him. The word Powders, the word Thursday, the name Hartfield. He was very still for a long moment after she finished. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Farrow." It was not a request. She sat. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her, looking out over the park's gray November distances. She watched his shoulders and the set of his head, and the way one hand closed at his side, and then opened again. The gesture of a man who is revising something, calculating something, arriving at a decision he had begun to make before she spoke. She had been raised to read rooms, and this one was telling her something she did not yet have the language for. "My brother, Lord Hartfield," he said without turning, "is in some difficulty. There are people in this county who would prefer that difficulty to deepen rather than resolve. If you observed what you describe on the morning of the 14th, you are a witness to the use of my household's kitchen as a staging ground for something I have been attempting to locate for 6 weeks. The letter you describe was not a culinary note." He turned then. His face was the same. His eyes were not. "I am sorry," he said, "that you were placed in this position without your knowledge. Mr. Hadley should have told you more before you accepted the post." She looked at him. There was something precise in the apology, something that did not perform more than it meant, and she found it startled her more than she had expected. She had grown accustomed in the last year to being apologized to with a quantity of feeling that bore no relationship to any intention to change the cause. "Why was I chosen for the position?" she said. A pause. Then, "Because Mr. Hadley was confident that you would manage a difficult situation with competence and without drawing attention, and because your father was a man I respected." She had not expected that. She did not let it show. Her father had died owing £1,400 and a great deal of other things that could not be counted in money, and she had spent the better part of a year arranging the wreckage with her jaw set and her eyes dry, and she had not thought about being respected in a long time. She filed it somewhere careful and kept her face level. "What do you need from me?" she said. He told her. Mrs. Prewitt had held the cook's position at Ashmore Park for 22 years before her appointment as housekeeper, and she had held the housekeeper's position for 8 years after that. And in those 30 years, she had accumulated the particular authority of a woman who has outlasted 3 separate categories of household crisis and can be relied upon to outlast 3 more. She had seen 2 funerals and 1 christening. She had seen the arrival of the present Duke's wife, and the departure of that wife in a traveling carriage with the curtains drawn, and the particular quiet that had settled over the house in the years since. She had also seen, without saying so to anyone, that Lord Carteret visited Ashmore Park twice in the weeks before the previous cook had given notice so suddenly, and that Lord Carteret always used the garden gate, and that the key to the garden gate had appeared in his possession in a way she could not account for. Cecily learned all of this from Mrs. Prewitt on the 6th morning after the study interview, when she found the older woman sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper in front of her, and the look of a person who has been carrying a weight alone for a very long time, and has at last decided, in the privacy of early morning, to set it down. "I did not know what it meant," Mrs. Prewitt said, smoothing the paper with one broad hand. "Not until you came. I thought he was a friend of the family. He carried himself as though he had every right to be here." "How long have you had this?" Cecily said. "Since August." She did not look up from the paper. "He left it on the gate-post the morning after Lord Hartfield's last visit. I thought it was a household note of some kind, left for me. I read it, and then I kept it, because I did not understand it, and I could not think what to do with it. And the longer I waited, the less clear it became what doing something would even mean. The note was not addressed to Lord Carteret. It was addressed to someone identified only by 2 initials, and a street in Bristol. It listed a quantity of a preparation whose name Cecily recognized from her father's medicine cabinet as a compound that, administered in small regular doses over a period of weeks, would not kill a man, not directly, not in a way that could be attributed to anything other than constitution, but would make him ill enough to seem, from a distance, to be failing. Beneath the list of measures was a date. Beneath the date was the instruction to have the preparation ready before the new household staff arrived. They had planned to use the kitchen because they had planned to use the cook. Not Cecily specifically. Any cook. A transient member of staff with insufficient history in the household who would arrive into an already prepared story and serve as the ending of it, the explanation that the household's difficulties required. They had been patient and methodical about it, which was, Cecily thought, the most unsettling part. Cruelty of impulse is one thing. Cruelty of arrangement, laid out in advance over months, indexed to a schedule, is another kind entirely. She sat with this understanding for a long moment, aware of her own hands on the table, the cold of the stone beneath them, the sound of the fire in the kitchen hearth, the smell of proving bread she had set an hour ago, and which was rising quietly on the shelf behind her. She thought about the 11 days she had spent learning the geography of this house, the weight of every room she entered, the quality of his attention when he moved through a corridor, and she felt it alter the air from 30 feet away. She thought about what it costs a person to be made into a story by people who have never troubled to learn their name. "We are going to need Mr. Hadley," she said. "The Duke has already sent for him," Mrs. Prewitt said. The gathering that took place in the Duke of Wyndham's study 4 days later was not large. It did not need to be. Mr. Hadley was present. Lord Hartfield himself had been brought quietly from the neighboring estate, where he had been recovering from what his physician had been told was a persistent bilious complaint. 2 magistrates from the county seat were in attendance, men of the older type who wore their authority like a coat, owned for 40 years, and had never needed to explain it. Lord Carteret was invited under the impression that he was being consulted as a witness to the household's recent difficulties. Cecily was not in the room. She was in the kitchen, where she had been since the magistrate's arrival, and where she intended to remain until she was sent for. She had been clear about this. When the Duke had informed her that her testimony and Mrs. Prewitt's document would be central to what was about to occur, she had said that she would provide whatever account was needed through Mr. Hadley, who would carry the document up and read it in her words. She did not need to be in the study for the first part. She understood the sequence. She was therefore at the work table when the bell rang a second time, and Mr. Hadley came back down the stairs with a look on his face, unlike any she had seen from him. "He wants to see you," he said. The study was different. The magistrates had risen to their feet. Lord Carteret was not present, having been escorted from the room in a manner that would require him to account for himself at considerable length to a number of people whose good opinion he would shortly discover he required and could no longer obtain. Lord Hartfield sat by the fire with a cup of something warm cradled in both hands, and the face of a man who has been ill in a slow, incremental way for months, and is only now beginning to understand the exact shape of what was done to him, the specific dimensions of the wound. He stood when Cecily entered. She had not expected that. "Miss Farrow," he said, "I owe you a debt I am not sure I have the vocabulary for." She looked at him. He was the kind of man whose manners had been so thoroughly formed that even in the aftermath of something grave he defaulted to courtesy, and she found it unexpectedly moving, the small, precise dignity of it. She said only that she was glad he was recovering. The Duke was standing by the window again. He had not turned when she entered, but she was aware of him in the way she had been aware of him since the morning in the study 3 weeks before, a particular quality of attention that was not the same as being noticed by anyone else who had looked at her in the last 12 months. His hand was at his side, Not closed this time. Simply present. The matter will be dealt with by the magistrates, he said without turning. Lord Carteret will not be the only man called to account. The Bristol address is now known to the bench. Mr. Hadley will send you the details when proceedings are concluded. He paused. A pause of the calibrated kind. The kind that carries weight. I would also ask that you consider whether you wish to remain in the position, given the circumstances that brought you here. Cecily thought about this for a moment. She had not expected to be asked. She had expected to be thanked, and possibly paid for the inconvenience, and she had been prepared to receive that outcome with the composure she had spent a year perfecting. The question was different. It required a different kind of composure. I would like to remain, she said. He turned then. There was something in his face that she had not seen in the study. Not during the dinner. Not across all 11 days of careful observation. She would not have called it open. He was not an open man, and she did not think he would become one. Not entirely. Not in any way that would read as such to anyone who had not been paying close attention. What she saw was a shift, the particular shift of a door that has been kept closed for a long time, moving, slightly, of its own accord. He was looking at her the way she had sometimes looked at rooms she was trying to read, with the full and unguarded attention of someone who is not performing the act of looking. She felt it land. She did not step back from it. Then we are glad to have you, he said. The words were level. His eyes held something entirely different. If there is a moment in every story when the audience understands before the characters do what is going to happen, this was it. Mrs. Prewitt, who had been standing outside the study door on the pretense of adjusting the hall table arrangement, later said she had known since August. She said the particular way the Duke had spoken Miss Farrow's name the morning after the servant's passage incident was not the way a man speaks the name of a cook, not a name he is cataloging, but a name he is being careful about, which is a different and more revealing thing entirely. The months that followed were not without difficulty. Lord Carteret's claims about the household's new cook circulated in the county for some weeks before the magistrate's inquiry concluded and their findings were made known. And during that period, Cecily moved through Ashmore Park with the particular knowledge that she was being watched from a distance by a class of people who had already decided what she was. She was accustomed to being watched. She had spent a year under the season's assessment and had learned to carry herself through it without adjusting her posture to accommodate its verdict. There was one afternoon in particular, in the second week of December, when she had gone to the market in the village to consult with the fish merchant about the Christmastide order, and had encountered, in the narrow street outside the draper's, 3 women whose names she did not know, but whose expressions she recognized perfectly. They looked at her the way the season looks at a woman who is standing slightly outside its approved categories, the way a room looks at someone it has not yet decided what to make of, and they said nothing to her and nothing about her within earshot. But she felt the verdict in the particular quality of the silence that followed her down the street for half a block. She had been called, at various times in the preceding weeks, by the servants of neighboring households who visited the kitchen on routine errands, a girl with no proper training, someone who had come with no proper history, a cook who had arrived with no proper references. The 3 voicings had reached her in 3 different settings, through a footman's passing remark, a dairyman's offhand mention, and a terse note sent from the neighboring estate's housekeeper who had been a friend of the previous cook. 3 separate settings. 3 separate speakers. The same underlying verdict, which was that she was provisional, a placeholder, a woman whose presence at Ashmore Park did not yet add up to anything the county could calculate. She found it easier than she had expected to bear. She was not sure whether this was because she had grown genuinely harder in the last year, or because she was standing inside a house that, whatever its complications, had not asked her to pretend to be anyone other than exactly who she was. In the evenings, after the kitchen work was done and the household had settled into its night routine, she sat at the kitchen table and wrote letters to her friend in Bath, who had been her companion through the worst of the year before, and she read and she thought about what she was doing in this house and whether it was what she had intended. She could not always answer that question plainly. She could answer the one that mattered more. The Duke came downstairs to the kitchen on the 15th of December. Mrs. Prewitt later reported that this was an event without precedent in 30 years of her tenure, and she said it with the particular expression of a woman who is delighted by a development she has been quietly expecting for some time. He came on the stated pretense of consulting about the Christmastide menu. He sat across the work table from Cecily with a cup of tea she poured without being asked, and the proposed menu lay between them on the surface, and they discussed it with full attention for precisely 5 minutes, after which the menu ceased to be the subject of the conversation. He had a way of listening that was nothing like politeness. Politeness is the performed surface of attention, the correct disposition of the face toward a speaker. What the Duke of Wyndham offered at the kitchen table was attention itself, the real article, the kind that does not wander and does not calculate its next remark while the other person is still speaking. It fell on Cecily with a weight she had not felt in a very long time, a weight she had not expected to feel again and was not entirely prepared for. She held herself, as she had learned to do, with no opening for assessment to find purchase. She found it less necessary than usual. She found herself, by the end of the second hour, sitting with her elbows on the kitchen table and her chin on one hand, talking about her father, and about the parish library in Bath, and about what it is like to read a book by firelight when you are too cold to sleep and cannot afford another candle, and not once noticing that she had dropped the posture she had spent a year building. "My brother tells me," he said at some point in the late part of the evening, "that you are the reason he is alive." "Mrs. Prewitt kept the note," Cecily said. "Mrs. Prewitt kept the note," he agreed. "You ask the right question." He was looking at the table rather than at her. "In the study, the morning I explained the situation. Most people facing an uncertainty of that kind ask what will happen to them. You asked what you could do. I have thought about it more than once since." She did not know what to say to this. She said nothing, which turned out to be the correct answer, because the silence that followed was not empty. It had the quality of something that had been waiting for permission to exist. He left at 10:30, which was an extraordinarily late hour for a duke to be in his own kitchen. And Mrs. Prewitt, who had been conspicuously absent the entire time, and who reappeared at the kitchen door precisely 4 minutes after the Duke had gone back upstairs, said nothing about this. She simply looked at Cecily with the expression of a woman who has been right about something for a long time, and sees no reason to say so. It was on the second kitchen visit, 4 days later, that the Duke told her about his wife. He did not plan to, she was certain of that. She was. They had been talking about the Christmastide arrangements and the particular difficulty of sourcing the right quality of dried fruit before the holiday, which was a practical conversation of a kind she had begun to find oddly sustaining in this household. And then he had been quiet for a moment, in a different way from his other silences. He looked at the fire. "There is a portrait," he said, "in the East Gallery that has been turned to the wall since the autumn of 1813. The household has not spoken of it to me. I have not asked them to speak of it. My wife died in November of that year. She was 27 years old, and she died in a house I was not in, because I had stayed in town on business that I had afterward no memory of ever needing to transact." He did not look at Cecily as he said this. He did not look at her afterward either. He looked at the fire with the face of a man who has lived with a thing for so long that the telling of it has lost all its acute edges and left only the dull, particular weight of something permanent. I do not tell you this for sympathy, he said. I tell you because I think you should understand why this house runs the way it does, and why I notice what I notice, and why I cannot, as it turns out, simply proceed with the ordinary arrangements of living without being somewhat certain that the people I am responsible for are accounted for at all times. She thought about this for a long moment. That is not a defect, she said. That is what it looks like to have learned something at great cost. He looked at her then. It was the same look as the study, but closer, and she did not look away from it. Lord Hartfield recovered his full health by Christmas. He came to Ashmore Park for the holiday dinner and sat at the long table with more color in his face than Cecily had seen that first terrible evening, and he ate 3 courses without incident and raised his glass at the end of the meal in the direction of the kitchen stairs, which was a gesture so unexpected and so specifically kind that Mrs. Prewitt wept into her apron, and Cecily accepted it with more composure than she felt, which is to say that she went into the scullery for 2 minutes afterward on the pretense of checking on the preserving pots. The magistrates concluded their inquiry in the 3rd week of January. The man in Bristol appeared before the county bench and gave an account of himself that was sufficiently detailed to implicate not only Lord Carteret, but 2 other members of the county who had stood to benefit from Lord Hartfield's protracted illness and eventual disappearance from the question of a particular property encumbrance. Lord Carteret's role was named publicly. The county society that had received him and his polished, reasonable confidence for 20 years received him now with a very different expression, and the adjustment was not subtle, because county society does not make subtle adjustments. It makes formal ones, with the whole mechanism of morning calls and dinner invitations, and the distribution of seats at public assemblies operating in the service of the reckoning. Every door closing at the correct angle, every greeting falling precisely 1 degree short of the previous one. His wife, who had known nothing, was received with warmth and sympathy. He was not. In February, when the grounds of Ashmore Park were still held in frost, and the trees stood in their bare winter geometry against the pale sky, and the household had settled back into the quiet of an ordinary winter, the Duke came to the kitchen again. He came without pretense this time. He sat at the work table, and he said, without preamble, I would like to speak to you about something that is not the household accounts. It was the first time she had seen him uncertain. It was very brief and very controlled. But it was there, a slight care in the choosing of words that was different from his usual precision, which is a care of efficiency. This was the care of a man who has decided that something matters enough to risk the misunderstanding. Cecily, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It sat in the kitchen air like a note struck clean on a piano, irrevocable and precisely itself, and she felt it move through her in a way that had nothing to do with ceremony, and nothing to do with management, and everything to do with a warmth she had been pretending, for some weeks, to be carefully uncertain about. She waited. I am not certain, he said, that I am an easy man to know. I have been told so on more than one occasion. I believe the testimony is reliable. You are not easy, she agreed. You are precise. They are not the same thing. Something happened in his face at that. The door opened another inch. She could see behind it now, if only just. I would ask, he said, whether you would permit me to speak to Mr. Hadley on a matter not related to the household accounts or the Bristol inquiry. She understood him. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the frost-hardened park was beginning, in the very earliest way, to soften toward spring, the light lasting slightly longer each evening, the stone walls pale gold in the late afternoon, where before they had been gray. Somewhere above them, Mrs. Prewitt was crossing the gallery with the measured tread of a woman who is walking at exactly the pace appropriate to someone who has no particular reason to hurry and no particular interest in what is happening in the kitchen. "I would permit that," Cecily said. He looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face then was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life, not as a memory of triumph or of beauty, but as the memory of a man who has spent 35 years learning to keep his interior in a carefully sealed room, discovering, at last, that there is someone worth opening the door for. He put his hand on the table, not touching hers. Close enough to touch. The fire snapped in the kitchen hearth. The pale February light lay across the stone floor between them, like a promise that had not yet been spoken and did not need to be. Mr. Hadley came to Ashmore Park on the 4th of March, having received a letter from the Duke that he later described to his clerk as the most carefully composed document he had encountered in 30 years of practice, which was a high bar and which he did not clear lightly. The matter was concluded with efficiency and with a legal permanence that satisfied all parties and gave considerable pleasure to the two magistrates, who had been hoping, since the January inquiry, for something to happen in this household that would give them occasion to return. The announcement appeared in the County Gazette 10 days later. The household at Ashmore Park received it in the way that large households receive news that they have been quietly anticipating, not with exclamation, but with small private acts of ceremony. Mrs. Prewitt made the particular lemon pastry she reserved for occasions of real significance, and had not made, by her own account, since the year the previous Duke had settled a debt of honor that had clouded the estate for a decade. The footmen wore their best livery to dinner without being asked. Lord Hartfield sent a letter from his estate that the Duke read standing at the study window, with his back to the room for a long time. The Season, at its considerable distance in London, received the news, and did what the Season always does. It discovered, without apparent difficulty, that it had always known Cecily Farrow to be of exactly the quality the Duke of Windham had recognized. Her father's family was respectable. Her education was apparent to anyone who had ever had a conversation with her. The circumstances of the last year had been regrettable, but were not, on reflection, anything that reflected on her character. The Season said all of this to itself in drawing rooms across Mayfair, with the smooth efficiency of an institution that does not acknowledge its own errors, only the eventual inevitability of truth. Cecily, who was at that time a guest at Mrs. Hadley's table in Bath, for a small celebratory dinner, and who had just received a letter in a handwriting she had been learning to recognize at a distance for 6 weeks, did not listen to what the Season said about her. She had stopped listening to the Season when it had stopped telling her anything useful, which was approximately the morning she had found a letter beneath a flower jar in a cold kitchen, and asked herself the only question that had ever produced a clear answer. "What do you need from me?" The letter from Ashmore Park was short, formal in its address, and then formal in precisely nothing else. It noted that the frost on the east kitchen garden wall had broken up at last, and that the early snowdrops were attempting something along the south-facing beds. It mentioned that Mrs. Prewitt had made a decision about the spring household arrangements that he had approved without discussion, because she had looked at him in a way that made the conversation brief, and he had long since learned to distinguish the situations that warranted argument from the ones that did not. It mentioned, at the end, with the particular plain directness of a man who has spent 35 years building precision and has decided that the most precise thing he can now do is say what he means, that Ashmore Park was considerably quieter than he preferred these days, and that he was looking forward to the 22nd of March with a feeling he was prepared to acknowledge in writing. was not patience. She folded the letter along its crease. There was one candle on Mrs. Hadley's table, burning low by that hour, and the street sounds outside the window were the evening sounds of Bath doing what Bath does in early March, which is to pretend that spring has arrived while still keeping its cold available for regular reminders. Cecily held the letter for a moment in the warm circle of the light. She had been carrying his letters in the pocket of her gown for 6 weeks now, which was not a thing she had decided to do so much as a thing she had found herself doing without choosing, the way you find yourself doing the things that matter before you have named them as such. She placed the letter with the others. Then she picked up the pen and began to write back. And she wrote with the same plainness that his letters had taught her was permissible between two people who have decided not to perform their feeling, but to have it. And the candle burned lower as she wrote. And outside on the Bath Street a late carriage passed, and in the kitchen of Ashmore Park, on a shelf above the work table where Cecily had spent 6 weeks cooking for a household that was about to be hers, the early snowdrops Mrs. Prewitt had cut that morning stood in a jam jar of water and waited for the 22nd of March. If you have stayed with this story to its quiet end, leave a word below. The ones who wait for the turn are the ones worth writing for. The cook who had come to Ashmore Park in November with one good trunk and a letter of reference would leave it in March with a name she had chosen, a household she had earned, and the knowledge that the season's verdicts, however confidently delivered, are always penultimate. They are not the last word. They are only the word spoken by people who have not yet looked carefully enough. She blew out the candle. The room held the dark for a moment. Mrs. Hadley knocked at the door and said there was cake, and Cecily said she would be there in a moment. She was.